On to the main event, trashing trust, lies, damn lies, statistics and government. And I do love saying that title because you can say it with a real punch and say it through your teeth. So here to chair our discussion this evening is Joyce McMillan, who's a political commentator and theatre critic for The Scotsman. She's been involved in many campaigns for democracy and human rights in Scotland and internationally, and there is no better woman to lead us through this maze. So welcome to you all, and thank you to our panelists, and I'll hand over to Joyce to introduce this evening's panel.
Thank you very much, Helen, and thanks very much for involving me in this, which is a really great subject, I think, and a very, very important one for this moment. And thank you for that very kind introduction as well. Trashing trust, lies, damn lies, statistics and government. Well, I doubt if there's ever been a period in British politics or indeed in global politics where statistics have, and people's trust or lack of trust in them, have mattered more. All of us need to know how well our governments are handling the COVID-19 epidemic. We need to know that so that we know how best to protect ourselves and our families. It's a moment when the numbers and the statistics that governments use have become kind of personal to all of us and tremendously important in our day-to-day lives. The other night I got involved in a conversation about the pandemic on Twitter and encountered one person, just one, but you know, he's not alone, I think it was a he, who simply said, "The virus doesn't exist, prove that it does." And I think that kind of comment, which is not uncommon on social media, does show the extent to which trust has been trashed or has declined or has in some way become a much less prominent feature of our sort of social interactions, certainly in the UK as a political community. Over my lifetime, I think there was a time when very few people would have doubted the word of scientists and government in the way that it's routinely doubted now. That may be true or it may not be true. We have two brilliant speakers here tonight to help us think our way through some of these issues and whether, if there has been a decline in trust, what has caused it, how deserved or undeserved is it, and what can be done about it. Stephen Reicher is, and he has a very impressive title, the Bishop Wardlaw Professor of Social Psychology in the School of Psychology and Neuroscience at the University of St Andrews, which is where I was a student many, many years ago, so long ago that nobody can really remember it now. But it's great to welcome you this evening, Stephen. Stephen's got a particular interest in issues of group behaviour and in the relationship between individuals and society or societies. He's involved at the moment, for instance, in research into how devolution has affected Scottish identity and social action in Scotland. He's also at the moment involved in discussions around people's response to the COVID epidemic. He has recently published a paper called Together Apart, the Psychology of COVID-19, together with other academic experts, and he sits on the independent SAGE committee, which offers advice, whether it is taken or not, to the various governments on the COVID epidemic. So welcome, Stephen. It's great to have you here. And our other speaker is Darren McGarvey, also known as Lockie, particularly in his career as a rapper. Darren is a writer, a rapper, and a commentator on social and cultural affairs. And Darren's book, Poverty Savari, was published to great acclaim back in 2017 and went on to win the Orwell Prize, one of the most prized, the most valued prizes for social and political writing in the UK. And Darren, unusually among British writers about social issues, has had first-hand experience of many of the problems related to poverty, which he describes so eloquently in that book, and is now a much sought-after commentator on these issues, although that, again, is a role which, in a society as divided as ours at the moment, does bring its pressure. So welcome, Darren. We're so glad that you're able to join us this evening. So I will not take up any more of your time. I think we're all aware of how vital the issues encapsulated in the title of tonight's session are. So I'm going to go straight to Darren, who's going to kick off proceedings by giving us his short take for 5 or 7 minutes on where he sees us as being in relation to trashing trust. Thank you, Darren.
Thanks very much, Joyce, for the introduction, and hello to Stephen and everyone who put the event together. Welcome to everyone who joined. I'm not going to take too much time with my kind of provocation. I always feel a bit dubious about calling it a provocation, given I've got a bit of a history of actually provoking people. However, I think just for me, I like to kind of just ground it. First of all, in terms of public trust, what are we talking about? You know, it's a term that's thrown around a lot. I think that public trust among the sections of the population and electorate that we're making specific reference to, which I think is almost exclusively people from disadvantaged or working class backgrounds. That section of the population which has become increasingly more significant in terms of creating massive political and economic upsets like Donald Trump or Brexit, and no doubt countless more as the coming years play out. So I think public trust among that section of the population has always been pretty low, in terms of a general scepticism that the institutions populated by predominantly middle class professionals and presided over by upper class politicians aren't really there to serve them, and the values and the prevailing sensibilities of those classes, which are a lot more closely entwined than some people might believe, they ultimately, I feel that these sensibilities and the orthodoxies that arise from them, they bear no relation to the average person sitting at home, whose experiences and the intuitions that arise from them are often not just different but diametrically opposed in terms of how they see the world, the values that they adopt, even right down to what they think is appropriate or is urgent, and even right down to things like humour and language. So we often see a bit of a ravine that's been cleaved in public discourse for a while, but it hasn't been as evident because we haven't always been living in the age of social media and Facebook and Twitter, which has expanded, to put lightly, the public square. And so what we now have is an establishment and institutions and professionals, whether in media or academia or elsewhere, who are dealing with a new kind of dissent. And this dissent takes different forms. You know, sometimes it can be vulgar, sometimes it can be aggressive, sometimes it can be driven by so-called conspiracy theories. But I think first and foremost, when a lot of people refer to a collapse in public trust, it isn't always because people are running around talking about fake news. It's because a lot of people who have been relatively unchallenged are now experiencing a pushback, are experiencing the weight and the gravity of sections of the population that they were only aware of in the abstract. And so that can be quite jarring, and I've experienced some of that myself, despite the fact that I grew up in a community such as the one that I'm describing. So people who grow up there, they grow up in a culture where there's a sense of resignation, that political participation is pointless and almost naive, and this is engendered in people as they grow up, and this is reflected in the statistics around political participation and generally the political orthodoxy of the last 20-30 years or so, particularly when Blair came into power in 1997, is that ultimately you can go about your business as a politician, or you could at least, without necessarily having to factor in how the working class were going to vote, because the middle class came to dominate, not just culturally, but there were more middle class people than working class people in Britain by the time Blair came to power. And so that was kind of the key strategic insight of New Labour, which was we can continue to absorb more middle class support, more conservative voters, by using these tricks of language, tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime, and ultimately shore up their position politically. And while that did have a lot of positive benefits in the short term, I think ultimately what it also exposed was that society is governed and discussed and administered and facilitated by people who see themselves as middle class, whether they're conservative or liberal. It doesn't really matter. There are some fundamentals that run right through that particular kind of class consciousness, and so many people as spectators on society, they get to a point where they become so frustrated that the discussion that's happening bears no resemblance to their experiences, that it just takes the right kind of demagogue to enter the public square with a better understanding of that sort of public mood and a better understanding of the technology that is now available, where they can actually begin to harness that to quite devastating effect. And I use the word devastating to be interpreted whatever way you want to interpret. But ultimately, what's been exposed here, apart from the unprecedented levels of incompetence of people who we've elected to put in power, off the back of constitutional issues and very narrow nationalist issues, and now we see how out of their depth they are when we are confronted by a global crisis. But also what we've learned, and I think the term social distancing is actually very appropriate here, we've learned about the lack of proximity, the danger of a lack of proximity between people who are in charge and people who are in charge and presiding over issues over which they have little to no experience whatsoever. And I'm not saying that lived experience trumps. I'm not saying that lived experience trumps scientific research. I'm not saying that lived experience trumps, going to university for 7 years and becoming very knowledgeable in a particular field. But I do think that it lends context to many of the trends that we see, particularly in terms of attitudes, behaviours that have begun to shift in the last few years. And this is just something that a lot of political leaders, still relatively insulated socially, culturally and economically, kind of fortified by the sort of shrinking sphere of privilege that does exist in society. Still, even now, the message isn't getting through. And that's really where I'm coming from with this. The other day when we were discussing the kind of pre-discussion, I used the example of Steve Bannon, who arguably is the reason Donald Trump got elected. Donald Trump was nowhere to be seen in the polls. Bannon entered the fray, and basically he came with this kind of doctrine of economic nationalism. Basically was talking about corporate oligarchies. He was talking about a corrupt banker class. He was talking about the 2008 financial crash. He was talking about how immoral a lot of the wheeling and dealing back then was. And a lot of people came to Bannon without any kind of prior knowledge of the fact that he was started Breitbart News, which is one of the worst offenders when it comes to stirring up the current culture war environment that we see. So they're just sitting there, and for the first time maybe in years, they're seeing someone on a mainstream news program who's talking very frankly about facts, economic and social and cultural, which cannot be disputed. The fundamental unfairnesses of our system, not fundamental unfairnesses that are as a result of some kind of accident or rupture, but unfairnesses which are written into the DNA of Western advanced industrial economies. And so when they're sitting there and they're seeing this person who's not been invited on to talk about that, because nobody else gets on to talk about that, that's too radical for a mainstream discussion. He's invited on because he's controversial, because he has controversial opinions about immigration. But actually, when he's there to discuss immigration, he's smuggling in all of these other ideas, which are actually the thing that are really endearing him to that subsection of the population who are watching, who think, wow, it's been so long since I heard someone talk honestly about the kind of world that we're living in. And so it becomes an incremental process of accepting one proposition of Bannon's about economic nationalism, and another one about corrupt bankers, and why didn't any of them get punished? And we used to hang speculators for doing the sort of stuff that we've given them license to do. And people are sitting there like that. Yep, that feels right to me. That feels right to me. And then you come further along, and then it's stuff about immigration, stuff that is a lot more racially provocative. Of course, by that time, the average person has already accepted these other propositions. They're already on board. The minute that they talk about even agreeing with anything Bannon says, they say that on Facebook, and then a bunch of people who might be a wee bit more informed about what Bannon is and what he really represents, chastise them for it, ostracise them for it, criticise them for it with no real awareness because of their lack of proximity, why this person's formed that viewpoint in the first place. And so I think, social media creates a real bin fire with this sort of stuff. And I think really we have to understand the emotional nature of a lot of the people who become endeared to that sort of thing, if we want to become in any way persuasive that maybe some of the propositions that they've accepted might not necessarily be good for them or society. And I'll just leave it there, and I'm probably not a bit longer than I meant to, but it's the first event I've done in about 5 months, so actually I've got more to say than maybe I thought I did.
Thank you very much, Darren. Thank you. I mean, I very much hear what you're saying, and I just wanted to ask you sort of directly, would you say then that insofar as people are signing up for the kind of belief systems, that we associate with the election of Donald Trump or with Brexit, and with, political campaigns backed by people like Steve Bannon, would you say that the kind of, I would say deliberate, and you mentioned the role of Blairism in this, but would you say that the deliberate exclusion of kind of socialist perspectives, or at least strongly social democratic perspectives from our public debate, has contributed to that kind of atmosphere of mistrust where people feel that their point of view is never being put, and that the only people that are actually putting a popular point of view are the far right?
If you look at some of the kind of political opinion and attitude surveys around, UKIP voters and then Labour voters, often the main area of divergence is attitudes towards immigration. You'll find that actually, there's a real core of the British population who believe in public services, they believe in the welfare state, they believe in immigration that's as long as it's kind of managed to a certain extent. And I don't think the left has done itself any favours, being kind of pathologically incapable of even engaging with the topic of immigration for years, as it was becoming the salient issue around which everyone else was regimenting, didn't help at all. But I think that that's beginning to resolve itself slightly, and you're seeing a bit of a divergence between more kind of liberal lefties and more socialist lefties who are interested in material conditions and economics. But certainly, yes, I think that there has been a problem. Even if you just look at, I'm no Corbynite, but even if you just look at the kind of sneering of mainstream journalists when he became leader, it was all very much, it's only a matter of time. How long can he last? And the reason for that was simple. It was because, he was so at that point far out with the prevailing sensibility and orthodoxy of what was deemed acceptable, that even objective journalists were really betraying their biases anytime that they spoke about him.
Thank you. Thanks, Darren. Yeah, well, a lot to talk about there, but certainly for whatever reasons, we conclude a large section of the population kind of looking for somebody to articulate their position, their sort of perspective on society, and really at the moment often finding it on the far right, which is a new development. Stephen, would you like to add your provocation to Darren's, as it were?
Provocation, yeah. Clearly it's a huge issue, and Darren has pointed to some of the scale of the issue. I want to start off by just making a couple of comments on what I think are broad social changes which underlie these issues of trust. So in many ways, we live in an increasingly complex world which is beyond a direct understanding. I mean, first of all, that's true technically. I often think 100 years ago, you lived perhaps 150 years ago. You lived in a world where most of the things that surrounded you, you knew, you understood, you could fix. You know, your light came from a candle, which you could blow out or you could light. You talked to people directly. You walked or you went on a horse, right? Whereas now I wake up from my mobile phone. Exactly how it works, I don't really know, but it works. You know, I get in my car. If my car breaks down, well, in the past, I might have been able to fix it. Now, it has to be taken to a garage. They put a new module in. Sometimes they have to tune it from another country. All these technologies, which are beyond our direct understanding. And the same goes at a social level. Most of the things that affect me are beyond my direct experience. I don't have that much direct experience of, you know, the global shifts in population which lead to migration. I don't have direct experience of understanding what the impacts of migration are. So more and more, rather than being able to live in a world of my direct experience and judge it by my direct experience, I depend upon other voices to explain it to me. And again, partly because of technology, partly because of the internet, there are more and more voices. Every single issue which is important to me, I turn on the radio, I listen to the television, I look at social media. There are 1,000 different voices shouting at me, saying immigration is terrible, it will destroy your society, or immigration actually is economically necessary. And if we have a problem with immigration, it's that we don't have enough immigrants to deal with our aging population. And with all those voices being positioned between so many complex voices on complex issues, which is beyond my direct experience, how do I choose? And that not only has implications for specific issues, what I think about Brexit, whether I believe that the COVID-19 pandemic is real and whether we should extend lockdown or open everything else up. It's also fundamentally important in terms of the very possibility of democracy in our society. Because in a sense, you can bring democracy down to the question of how do we deal with disagreement? If somebody disagrees with me, do I see them as an asset in that they force me to clarify my position, to check my position, to make sure I have evidence to support my position, that in political terms, an opposition is a loyal opposition, which is necessary to hone the policies which are necessary to make our society work? Do I see opposition as part of a common community with whom I'm debating? I might be trying to defeat them, but they're part of a common community who have a common interest in our common good. Or do I see them as the other? Do I see them as an enemy? Do I see them as people who don't have our best interests at heart, who simply want to confuse or want to destroy? And in many ways, that comes down to that question of, do I see these people as part of a common social, political, national, international community? Or do I see them as an outgroup, as the other, as people who have the interests of a different and opposed group at heart? And it seems to me that one of the best diagnostics of seeing incipient authoritarianism and an anti-democratic position are those people who, whenever they encounter opposition, try to delegitimate that opposition by saying they are other, by saying they are outgroup. I remember many years ago, I was on holiday in Turkey when Erdogan was first standing for presidency, and there was an English language Turkish paper. And the thing that struck me is every one of his opponents, he said, is not a Turk. They're not disagreeing with me because they have the interests of Turkey in mind. They are a Kurd, they are an Alevi, they are other. And we saw the same with Donald Trump. Anybody who disagrees with Trump is not part of a common community, a person of goodwill who's trying to debate. They are a Mexican if they're a judge who says that he's corrupt in terms of his university. When he was talking about Hillary Clinton, he didn't call her foreign, but he said, lock her up because she's outside the community, she's a criminal. Famously, of course, he says of Obama, he's not American, doesn't come from America, he's outgroup. So this question of whether somebody is of us or not of us, in-group or out-group, is absolutely essential to the question of whether we trust them or not, and absolutely central then to the question of whether we can have democratic debate with them or not. And if we can't have democratic debate, if we can't reason with people, the only thing we can destroy is to destroy them. And the only thing which determines what is true and what isn't is naked power, my ability to silence you, or to shout louder than you, or to hit you over the head if you don't do what I like. And it seems to me that the fundamental shift in British society isn't this general process, the fact that we always have to judge information in terms of its source. And in fact, we'd be stupid not to. If I went to a second-hand car salesman and he said to me, this is a lovely little runner, beautiful, it's you know, great petrol consumption, you'll love it. If I trusted him, I would be a fool, because of course his interests are opposed to mine. What has changed, however, is who we see as in-group and who we see as out-group. The way we draw these categorical lines and therefore who we can debate with. A number of years ago, for instance, we would think of a leader as a leader of our party, as in-group. So if you were in a Labour Party, a Labour leader would be fundamentally Labour. If you were a conservative leader would be fundamentally conservative. Now things have shifted. And I think the expenses scandal was ideologically key to this. Now we have a sense of they're all politicians. They're all out-group. They're interested in themselves, not interested in us, interested in, you know, our party or interested in our nation. They're just interested in themselves. And populists, of course, have leapt on this and have, if you like, promulgated a rather false and manufactured, but still very powerful anti-political politics. People asked, for instance, how come Donald Trump, despite the fact that he violates all the rules of politics, the fact that he's crude, the fact that he's unprepared, the fact that he's contradictory, how does he thrive? Well, he thrives precisely because those things say to people, I'm not an ordinary politician. I'm not like them. I'm one of us. I'm one of the people and the anti-political class. So one of the things that has happened has been the fact that politicians in general are seen as an out group and therefore we don't trust them. And I think the Brexiteers understood this full well. I remember the night before Brexit where they got all the living prime ministers together to say Brexit is a bad thing. And they thought that shows consensus, shows across the board, whether they're Conservative or Labour, then everybody realizes Brexit is a bad thing. And what they didn't understand is what they showed was a consensus of the political class. All these leaders, all these prime ministers, all these politicians are against you. And therefore, what the Remain side didn't understand and the Brexiteers did was precisely how alienated we are from politics and how an anti-political politics is so powerful. And the second thing they did was they made experts out-group. So, for instance, people who tried to look at the evidence of what Brexit would do, what it would do economically, what it would do socially, were turned into the other, into the part of the elite, this liberal elite living in universities with hundreds of books behind them, who are unlike normal people and aren't interested in normal people and get their grants from Brussels, from Europe, and therefore a part of that outgroup. What has changed then isn't this general notion that trust is tied to in-group, out-group. What's changed is the specific ways we draw those boundaries, and those who previously were part of the in-group are now seen as part of the out-group. And why has that happened? And here I think we have to critique ourselves. We can't just say these people are stupid, these people are foolish, because actually, and as Darren was pointing to this, what those populists have understood is a reality. And so, for instance, in terms of politics, if you look at all the evidence, it shows that if you're in the bottom third of the population, you're not listened to at all. Your realities don't count. Your problems don't form policy. And it's not only that, it's that politicians treat you as if you're not one of us. Actually, we're seeing that, I think, very clearly at the moment in terms of the way in which the UK government is handling the pandemic. They treat us like fools, you know, talking about world-class test and trace systems when we see we don't even have a half-decent test and trace system, not being open with us, not having a conversation with us, not respecting us, not admitting to their own fallibilities. We see they treat us not as you would treat one of us, but how you treat one of them, with disdain, without listening. There is not a conversation going on. And therefore, I think we need to understand that part of the reason why people see politicians as outgroup is because politicians see them as outgroup. And equally, I think we've got to be self-critical of ourselves as academics and as scientists, because again, I think we've made it easy for ourselves to be seen as one of them at all sorts of levels, at an institutional levels. Universities are deeply unequal places. They're deeply unequal in terms of who gets to them. They're deeply unequal in terms of who's excluded from that. We saw that without any doubt in the A-level, O-level, higher standard grade fiascos that we've seen over the last week, showing that actually what matters more is stability than allowing mobility for those who are most deprived. So our institutions exclude people. And then science isn't open enough. We're not open enough in our language. We're not open enough in our information. For me, open science, the transparency of science, allowing people to see the evidence, isn't a luxury. It's part and parcel of the scientific enterprise. And without it, again, we are the other, and people will stop believing us. Now, having said all that, and I think we should be self-critical, I don't think we should be too self-critical. If you look at the polling evidence, for instance, on trust in COVID-19, well, the UK government started at about 75%, as did the Scottish government. The UK government have fallen to about 40% or even less. The Scottish government is still at 75%. If you look at those who are most trusted, it is the NHS and it is scientists, but still there are problems. And so my final point, which I just want to reiterate, is this. Trust and lack of trust is bound up with questions of us and them. Questions of whether those who provide the information are doing it because they have our interests at heart, or whether we don't. And when we have multiple sources of information, often we will ask which of those sources is of us and which is not of us. And in our politics, and in our society, and in our science as well, we have created greater divisions, greater elitism, greater social inequality, which justify the way in which people see all these sources as them. And until we address that, and until we rectify that, then the polarizations we see are going to endure, and the dangers to democracy are going to endure as well. And I also should apologize for going on for far, far too long. I thought I was talking for about 5 or 10 minutes. You know? I've whittled on. I'll finish with a story. When my mother finished her first job, her boss said to her, he said, "You're all right, but you talk too much." And clearly it's genetic, so I do apologize.
Well, neither of you need to apologise. I thought those were two brilliant startups. If I could see the rest of the audience, which I can't, I would ask them all to give you a round of applause, but I'm giving you one anyway. I thought that was two really brilliant introductions to this issue. But I'm sort of hearing contradictions. I feel as if people who care about democracy and those sorts of values that you've been talking about, Stephen, are now in a kind of catch-22. It's like you can't do anything right. I mean, you've just pointed out the various ways in which the current UK government lives up to the bad stereotype of politicians. You know, they don't obey the rules. The Dominic Cummings scandal was a huge moment, I think, in that respect. They treat people with contempt. They tell a lot of lies and half-truths, all the rest of it. And yet they remain much more popular than anyone opposing them. Because they're riding this kind of wave of right-wing populism, it seems that these multiple ways in which they can be seen to betray public trust don't matter, because they're sort of on the right side of what currently in Western countries passes for history, you know?
Yeah, I think, so let's take what you said there, that these things don't matter. I think they do matter, but every person and every voter has a hierarchy of concerns. And if the concern that means most to them is best served by a group of, you know, in this case, you know, quite devious, cunning, maybe cunning's the wrong word, Dominic Cummings is cunning, then it's easy to look away and say, okay, I know they're up to no good in this regard, but they're serving my interest in this regard, and so I kind of have to turn a blind eye to that. And that's something that we all do. I mean, in America, the Democrats are doing it with Joe Biden. The person that he's running with not long ago was one of his biggest critics, and he's been accused of all sorts of things. And, you know, well, that's all allegations. At the same time, similar allegations made to someone across the aisle would have led to a very, very aggressive cancel culture impulse, and so on and so forth. So we all turn a blind eye when it suits us. And I think that sometimes it's important for us to ground any thinking about the behaviour of others with a kind of an awareness that we're all the same species, we're all made of the same fundamental software and hardware. And, you know, what Stephen was outlining there in the beginning of his provocation was, you know, a kind of an idea of a public discourse where it was guided by almost a kind of application at individual level of a sort of scientific method, which of course exists because of human flaws and frailty. So the whole reason for a scientific method is because humans can't be trusted to define what's true and define what's real, not as individuals, and certainly not in crowds and in groups. Of course, the other field that emerges out of that reality of the kind of glass ceiling of human comprehension and understanding is public relations, and it exists to perform all sorts of trickery. And so, you know, on one hand, you have people who are making this call for public discourse to be more, I don't know, reasonable, as maybe as a word to describe it. You know, don't see people as the other. Remember that the person that you're speaking to has a rich, complex life that has led them to whatever position that they hold. But unfortunately, while we can often marshal that kind of higher executive function of our mind to bring to bear that understanding temporarily, we're always operating off emotion. And the minute that we become stressed, or the minute we feel threatened, or the minute we feel personally attacked, then the reptile brain just kicks in. Now, Stephen will know this far better than me and be able to describe it far more eloquently. From what I have read, there are a couple of books that I've read from people whose politics I don't necessarily align with, but I think it's good practice to constantly be delving into opinions and outlooks that maybe jar with your own, or in many ways are opposed with your own. And two books that I think really captured the current moment in terms of the psychology aspect of it and the historical aspect of it was The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt, which really looked at the psychology of tribal cultures and why, you know, relatively good, decent, morally normal people disagree violently over issues of religion, or in America, things like gun control. And then another book which surprised me how much of it I agreed with was by Neil Ferguson, whose politics I don't necessarily align with very much, but his book, The Square in the Tower, which essentially drew parallels with historical parallels with, you know, the invention of the printing press, for example, or the Reformation, or other times where technology led to people of the time thinking that we were going to lead to some era of mass social connection and utopia, and these historical divisions of religion and race would just be erased. And in his book, he argues that Silicon Valley made the precise same mistake, having no historical understanding of how human beings as a species are kind of designed to polarize naturally. So I think on one hand, we can make these calls to reason and you should behave better in discussions and da-da-da-da-da. But we also have to understand that, as I say, when the stress response kicks in and people feel heated and people feel personally attacked, it's often not till 2-3 hours later, or in my case, sometimes months later, that I realise that I have behaved irrationally, that I have said something that I shouldn't have said, and I can go back and do the repair. But you know, Twitter and Facebook, they don't announce that globally. You know, one person out of the billions of people who use our platform has admitted they behaved irrationally the other day. These platforms are just designed to generate misunderstanding. They're designed to generate controversy. They're designed to keep a hold of our cognitive bandwidth for long enough to sell our data, to sell our attention spans for advertisers. And ultimately, when we are trying to solve public discourse through a medium where we're being presented by a limited amount of text, and language is actually our most recent evolutionary acquisition, and that we need to be in a room or physically see other people to really truly understand and comprehend what they're saying, then I think that really leads us to the central madness of social media, and in the truest sense that we have arbitrary limits on what we can say on things like Twitter, on Facebook, the way that algorithms work, the role that the kind of the dopamine release that we get when we're validated, when we're drawn into conflicts. There's just so much other stuff going on beneath the boot of the car that we can sit here and think we're being as rational as we like, but actually often we're more vulnerable to behaving in ways that are not dissimilar to the people that we see, you know, the people that we would otherwise, as Stephen puts it. But I completely accept all the premises of what Stephen has said there, and I think it's very eloquently outlined. I just, again, I always just kind of try and bring it back to my understanding of my own flaws and my own motivations and my own intentions, often which I'm not completely cognizant of when I go into an interaction, or when I'm reasoning my way through carefully selected facts to a conclusion that suits me and my career and how I believe people on the internet might perceive me. It takes a tremendous amount of mental agility and work and emotional energy and excruciating self-honesty to truly behave rationally in the public domain all the time. And so I think, while it's definitely a laudable aspiration, I think that we're going to have to try and come up with some other way to regulate how people behave online, because I don't think it should fall to the individual necessarily. And I definitely worry when we start talking in terms of individual responsibility in most realms of society, but particularly in social media, where we can see very clearly who's holding the strings. We can see very clearly who these platforms serve ultimately, and they appeal to our basest instincts, and that's definitely my view on that.
Thanks, Darren. I'm going to, we've got a few questions coming in from the audience now, but I'm going to give Stephen a chance just to come back on some of that before we jump to the audience. We've still got a bit of time for discussion. Yeah, Stephen.
Yeah. I profoundly disagree with Darren on this, and I'm much more positive about human psychology, and I worry about the ways in which politicians, not just politicians, so often blame on human psychology and the flaws of human psychology what they have actually produced themselves politically. So, for instance, my work started off with looking at work on crowd behavior, and crowds are supposed to be the crucible of irrationality. When we get together in groups, we behave irrationally. And the reason why that view came about was in the period of industrialization and a mass society, when the masses became powerful and challenged the status quo, then the elites became afraid of crowds and wanted to say of them, but they are irrational, don't listen to anything they say, trying to hide the fact that they weren't irrational, they had alternative ways of understanding how society should be organized. It's not they had a lack of understanding, they had an alternative understanding. We see that even today with the attacks on Black Lives Matter as being emotional, irrational, extreme, and so on, because the status quo doesn't want to hear what they are saying, which is a very clear and very legitimate understanding of a different society, which is organized in a different way. Or to use another example, if you look at most conflicts, when most intergroup conflicts happen, when there are hatreds and when there are genocides, very often you will find politicians saying, well, it's not our fault, it's ancient hatreds. It's groups who hate each other and we couldn't help it. For instance, Milosevic said that around the Balkan Wars. He said, well, Serbs, Croats, they're bound to hate each other. The reality was very different. Those groups didn't inherently hate each other. They had intermarried. And even when he tried to provoke people by saying, Croats are your enemy, it had no effect. He had to send in his own thugs to create provocations and fear before there began to be division. And so what he tried to do was to project on human psychology and the flaws of human psychology, the pathologies of his own politics. Now, I think this is really important when we come to something like COVID-19, because my experience in government has been time and again, government subscribes to this notion that human psychology is frail, and particularly when there's a crisis, we crack. And it's not surprising they like that, because if it wasn't true, there would be less need for them. If it wasn't true that you needed government to look after people, well, we might have a slightly different way of organizing society, which is more based on the locality, on the collective, on the population, and so on. And again, when you look at what's happened in COVID-19, they all expected that we wouldn't be able to cope with lockdown, we'd show behavioral fatigue, we would run around and cause disease. What we actually found is, despite considerable hardships, people came together collectively. They acted as a group. They acted for each other as a group. They drew on the support of others, and that collectivity and that expectation of support led to resilience, led to people obeying lockdown, even when 50% of the population, actually 44% of the population, the poll showed, were suffering considerably, were suffering both psychologically and economically. Of course, it was government people like Dominic Cummings for whom it was too difficult to obey lockdown, and so they had to go on a jaunt to Durham and so on. So this notion of psychological frailty, and in particular of psychological frailty when people get in a group, I think is wrong. It misunderstands the nature of human psychology. It misunderstands the way in which people collectively act in meaningful ways, not always ways that the state likes, not always ways that the powerful like, but ways that are meaningful and ways which are in many ways the harbingers of a different society and very often a better society.
Can I just come back to that quickly? Like, still keeping it open, but just a quick thing. I take on board what you've said there. You mentioned the example of a dictator introducing thugs into the crowd in order to kind of spread fear, which then made the crowd more susceptible to the messaging. So I think, in a way, maybe what I should have said, or another way for me to think about it, is that, you know, I don't necessarily mean that people organising en masse, or that crowds generally are inherently dangerous or inherently irrational. I simply mean that once people are operating in a climate of anxiety and a climate of fear and a feeling of being threatened, which is a lot of what we see, then I would still kind of contend what I had said previously. But I do realise there's an important distinction to make there. I don't mean that people are inherently mad or inherently kind of mentally dysfunctional. I just think that certain conditions, economic, cultural and social, as well as political, you're absolutely right about the political dimension of this and creating the conditions for so much upheaval currently. I do think that's an important distinction that I should have made. And that's all I wanted to say.
Gosh, well, I mean, just both listening to both of you and looking at the questions, I'm just realising there are so many dimensions to this issue. I mean, it really is, you know, it's a conversation that touches on every aspect of our politics at the moment. And I got strong feelings myself about this question of how we define human nature. There's a great book that I read from a more left point of view than the ones that Darren's just mentioned, called Rutger Bregman's new book called Humankind. Yeah. He's mostly famous for his arguments for universal basic income, but he puts a very strong case for the pro-social and benign and even playful aspects of humanity, which is part of our personality. And if we don't encourage and take account of those, then we do end up with very brutal societies and very brutal political theories. But anyway, Helen, have you been keeping an eye on these questions? And is there any that you think we should highlight now, just to take this discussion?
Yes, no, I think it's there's been a fantastic response. Thank you. Now, I'm just going to go to a question from Tim Ozdemir. His question is, should the government and media be held accountable for ensuring that the exposure of certain issues and views is proportionate to the actual matter in hand? So the inflated issues of the contribution of foreign aid, spend on EU membership, significance of the UK fishing industry when in context, they're tiny factors in the UK's budget. And I think, yeah, over to you.
Yeah, actually, Tim's made 2 points. So if I can just, because we don't have a huge amount of time, I wonder if I could just alert you to the other one as well, which is very interesting. So the first one is about the role of media and government in not, if you like, making sure that people are getting a kind of proportionate view of what goes on. And maybe the most profound example of that in British politics in the last decade is a sort of gross inflation of the idea of immigration as a sort of negative problem for everybody, which is still going on, as we saw with the kind of mock panic over the boats in the Channel just last week. But Tim's other question says it sounds like Stephen is saying that basic in-out group politics could be more critical to influencing society and gathering support than the misuse or misunderstanding of statistics or facts. Is that right? Has the public and government abandoned evidence and science? Conversely, commercial organisations are capitalising on data and analysis. So what's going on there? On one hand, we've got more data than ever before. On the other hand, we've got governments who are more interested in culture wars and loyalties and so on. So would either of you like to tackle either of those questions, the one about the media or the one about whether governments have kind of abandoned facts in favour of culture wars, essentially? Stephen? Go
ahead, Stephen.
No, here's Darren. Here we go.
I mean, both questions are absolutely critical, and I do think there is a huge issue of the accountability of the media. In psychology, people talk about what's called an availability effect. In other words, we judge things not on how often they happen, but on the extent to which information about them is available to us. And the extent to which they are available to us is a function of how newsworthy they are and news values. Now, part of that is ideological, clearly ideological, as in the case of immigration. And I mean, the number of straight lies or distortions about immigration is really quite remarkable. As I say, I mean, first of all, economically, immigration is good for us. That's number one. Number two, as I was saying earlier, if we have a problem of immigration, it's that we don't have enough immigration. We probably need about 1 million immigrants a year to cope with our aging population and to sustain old codgers like me in our dotage. And even claims like immigration being divisive, undermining identity, and so on. Actually, there isn't any clear evidence that diversity systematically undermines social cohesion or systematically undermines identity. So all of that is false. But I want to use a particular example, for instance, relating to the pandemic, given the pandemic is in all our minds. One of the things, actually it's a point I make about crowd behavior. If there are 1,000 crowds on a Saturday and there's violence at one of them, you know which one will be in the news and which 999 will be not spoken about, because big crowd, no violence isn't a headline. It is always true that violation, it's always true that crime will hit the headlines, whereas actually people acting in responsible ways will not. So if you look at adherence during the COVID-19 pandemic, the real headline news is the remarkably high levels of adherence amongst all groups. And there's all this demonization of young people. They're going out, they're partying, they're raving. Actually, the evidence shows that the great majority aren't. They're staying in, even though they personally are probably not going to be affected by the disease. And even though it's particularly difficult for them to stay in, but it's newsworthy to show people going out. And we saw, therefore, that when people went out, you would have photographs of them, often using zoom lenses to make them look closer than they actually were. So you could have outrage, shock, horror, look, they are violating. And not only was that wrong, but it was dangerous. Because if you begin to say to people, well, everybody else is going out and breaking lockdown, you create a social norm which leads others to say, well, no point my not doing it, I might as well do it as well. And one of the things that has surprised me, given that COVID is every bit as big a threat as a war, is there has been no attempt to bring editors together and talk about social responsibility and talk about the ways in which you report things. And the ways in which you report things isn't simply a matter of truth and falsity, it's a matter of actually creating noxious truth or creating noxious realities. So absolutely, on that issue of the responsibility of the media, and therefore questions about who owns the media and questions of what sort of media we have, that is absolutely central to our understanding of social reality and our behavior, whether it's in the pandemic, whether it's immigration, or whether it's anything else.
Thank you very much. Darren, did you want to come back on that before I take some more questions?
I just kind of wanted to, a couple of things. The first one being in relation to immigration. So my experience before in my kind of former life where I had a real job was, predominantly as a community arts facilitator and youth worker of 10 years experience working within different contexts like prisons or even on streets and youth clubs. Pretty much, I was the sort of person who was being sent to the hardest to reach kids because there was no one else who could engage them. And what I always found working with these kids was that they had already, in many cases, internalized racist attitudes. Now, it's different when you're working with kids and they're vulnerable. You can't call them out the way that people like to performatively do on Twitter. It makes no emotional sense in that moment. You have to trust your intuition and look for an opportunity to not necessarily challenge, but maybe even just draw out more of what they think so that you have more of a bearing on this kind of landscape that you're traversing. So what that taught me was that in some cases, those attitudes are learned very young, and that then a person grows up with that as a framing device for everything else that they see. But what I also learned was that a lot of people in communities, deprived communities or communities where immigration is a live issue, like Govan Hill. I used to do 5-a-sides with the Roma kids down there. What I found was that often people's concerns about immigration began from a place of emotional insecurity and emotional stress, increased threat sensitivity, risk perception. And so in more affluent communities perhaps, or more liberal communities, or whatever you want to call it, there's a sort of discourse that happens, there's engagement with other issues that happens, people talk about things, they consume a broader range of media. I mean, the fundamental class analysis of Britain that still rings true is how the media determines where you sit, ABC1, C2DE, and so on and so forth. So let's say the C2DE communities, they begin from a place of this community keeps changing. It's happening too fast. I heard a story about some boys around the corner that robbed a car. I went to the hospital the other day with my kid and I had to wait for 5 hours, and the place was full of brown people. And these are the kind of surface observations that they're making, right, which are racist in nature. But at the same time, they don't understand that. They're not acting from a place of, I'm being really racist right now in terms of my analysis of what's going on. The problem then is that once that becomes a kind of hardwired response, then you've got your Tommy Robinson who enters the fray, who's a very charismatic person, superficially charming, and he knows how to work this particular sort of social energy in order to kind of get it into that politically exploitable place. what I've found is engaging with people who are, you know, taxi drivers, for example. Couple of taxi drivers I've had that get in, they've got a Tommy Robinson podcast on, but they have stopped playing it as I get into the car. And then a conversation develops because it's a 25-minute journey. And actually what I'm finding when they're talking is that they don't necessarily seem to fit the kind of caricature of the racist, you know, neo-Nazi, skinhead, whatever you want to call it. They seem like a person who is operating in conditions of economic humiliation and are looking for a fucking explanation for it. And the only person who wants to offer the explanation and come into their life and seem to speak in a way that validates what they're going through is, you know, Farage or Bannon or Tommy Robinson. And so, you know, this is where I feel sometimes the left, we've let ourselves down, because we've, on one hand, we argue against conservatives who want to punish, and they see punishment as the primary mode of dealing with any sort of social behaviour that's unacceptable. And we say, no, we have to look at the root causes. No, we have to look at why did somebody become a drug addict? And this person's shoplifting because they've got heroin addiction and they need a fix every hour, or they go through excruciating physical and mental torture. But then on the other hand, someone who expresses an opinion or even a support of Tommy Robinson is so often quickly kind of categorised as part of a deplorable class. And while that certainly does apply in some cases, no doubt, and I wouldn't be shy in pointing that out in person or online, a lot of the people that I've run into in these communities, they are in every other sense decent, morally normal, with an active interest on what's going on in their community. They often lend themselves to community enterprises, and so it's you know, I always try and bring the immigration thing back to that. That's where it begins. Those conditions of economic humiliation and uncertainty.
Thanks, Darren. I mean, I think you can argue that this whole cycle of British politics began in that confrontation between Gordon Brown and Gillian Duffy, when she raised concerns, so-called concerns about immigration. I mean, I've got my doubts, frankly, about where these concerns come from, but nonetheless, she raised her concerns about immigration. Gordon Brown was heard dismissing her as bigoted, and so we began this whole cycle of the Labour Party doesn't understand, which even Jeremy Corbyn, who was willing to talk the language of socialism, couldn't then break that, given a very, very hostile media. But we now have a whole list of really terrific questions, which I want to quickly get out. Aisling has put several questions, some of which are absolute corkers. She says she's I'm taking it you're a woman, Aisling. I'm an immigrant on the socialist left. Am I in an in-group or an out-group? She asks. Obviously we can, you know, speculate on that. She says some UK governments have stroked culture wars. That's true. Not all have, and that's significant. But then we've got another question somewhere else from Robert Ray, who sees the current Scottish government as a sort of permanent stoker of culture war because of the othering of England, basically, and the constant claim to be doing better than England, even if that is a pretty low bar. Aisling also says, do you think the excessive focus on the type of political divisions we're seeing in England ignores the extraordinary political cooperation that people managed to create in Northern Ireland? What do you think we can learn from the Northern Irish process? And that coincides with what someone else said, Didi, quite a long time ago, while we were listening to the initial provocations. She was lamenting the absence in our politics now of people like John Hume, who seem to be able to win the trust not only of their own community, but of all communities, and kind of rise above those divisions. And Didi's question is, why would anyone truly decent with any integrity go into politics at all now? Because obviously she's answered her own question about why John Hume went into it, but why would anybody decent go into politics now? So that's a whole raft of questions, but all kind of bearing on the same issues. Who's in, who's out, who's stoking culture wars, what do we define as a culture war, and all the rest of it. And it's 12 minutes past 7. So we don't want to go on much beyond about 20 past. Our absolute deadline is 1/2 and we don't want to be crashing that.
I'll quickly outline how I was drawn into the culture war and the process by which I think most people are, and it's a process that they're largely unaware of as it is happening. So there's the culture war as it's understood by the people who've been involved in actively perpetrating it, usually online, between kind of, you know, differentiated along liberal left, conservative right lines. And then there's other people who get caught in the crossfire. So I remember just after the referendum in Scotland in 2014, I was performing and speaking at an event in Glasgow as part of the Yes movement. And as part of my improvised routine, I made a joke about Madonna falling down the stairs at an awards ceremony that she had been attending. And it was something that had been shown on media, and a lot of people were just kind of laughing about it. Do you know what I mean? Like, this is Madonna reinventing herself and blah, 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 blah. And there was during that performance, I think there was another artist she was performing with, a rapper called Drake. Basically, there was a big media controversy because at some point during the performance, she smacked the lips on him and kissed him, and this created this massive talking point. So my joke was something along the lines of, did you see Madonna forcing herself on Drake? Well, I guess it doesn't matter. Everything Madonna does is forced. And so basically, it was just a rubbish one-liner. It was just something I thought up on the spot. And honestly, within 5 minutes, I was confronted by women in the audience of varying ages who were challenging me for being misogynistic. And it was a strange new energy that I had never experienced before. And I handed the microphone down to the crowd thinking that this would kind of ameliorate the disruption to the show, and it just made everything worse. So eventually I walked off stage after the performance and the whole audience burst out into like a massive argument about what had just occurred. And then as I progressed for a few more months, these things started coming up again and again. So then you go into Google, you type in misogynist or you type in feminism, and this is the first time really you're engaging with it, or the first time I was actively engaging with it. And then actually the first options that come up in your Google results are Ben Shapiro, Milo Yiannopoulos, all of the kind of, you know, the basic, the Avengers of the culture war, you know what I mean, in terms of the other side. And so they start making arguments which intuitively feel correct, because what they're appealing to is your sense of exclusion. So I went through a period where just because I didn't know everything that other people knew, just by talking out loud, I was being accused of this, that, and the next thing. I was being kind of, I don't know, I felt like I was being marginalised in communities on the left. I was being discussed with a different kind of scepticism that somehow I was in some way dangerous or something. And it wasn't really until it kind of peaked where I wrote an article about gender-based violence, and there was one unfortunately written line in it, and it just felt like the forces of hell were trying to pursue me, and I nearly got sacked from a job I was in, and da-da-da-da-da-da. And it was only then when I was at the very cliff edge of almost renouncing all of my left-wing beliefs in favour of going into this new group, where it just seemed like there was a lot more flexibility to discuss all sorts of things, that I realised, actually, no, this is who I really believe in these things. I really believe in social justice. I really, really believe that we need a fairer economy, and I really, really believe that a lot of these people, even the ones that are coming after me, are marginalised in unfair and systemic ways. But it took a long time for me, and a lot of work and a lot of patience on the part of other activists to recognise that I was going through something on a personal level, and to be quite compassionate towards me when they were challenging me. If I was just reading the comments I was left online, then I suspect that I might have moved a wee bit further politically than I would have been comfortable with. And I think a lot of people get caught up in that. They're coming into discussions that seem like they're about social issues. They don't realise they're couched in a broader culture war where they are really just collateral damage. And then they become endeared to whichever side says things that, you know, validate them.
Darren, yeah, thank you. I mean, that's a really powerful point, because I am currently seeing it happen to a lot of people that I considered friends. Like the force of the disapproval that they can get on social media for saying one wrong thing is forcing them into very right-wing positions. Yeah. And that's really alarming. Steve?
I think Ashlyn's question, and her first question, am I in group or out group, is an absolutely critical question. It's a question I ask myself. You know, I am the son of Jewish migrants who fled from Nazi Germany and came to the UK. I was born, as you can tell from my accent, in England. I now live in Scotland. Am I in group or am I out group? So let me respond to that with a contrast. In 1934, Goebbels put out a little book called The ABC of National Socialism. And its first commandment was, love thy ethnic comrade as thyself. Okay. In 1940 and 1941, the Germans controlled Bulgaria. It was the one country under Axis control where twice they tried to deport all the Jews in Bulgaria. And twice they failed. In fact, at the end of the war, there were more Jews living in Bulgaria than at the beginning. And people were mobilized. And they were mobilized by arguments which said that actually the attack on the Jews is not the attack on them, it's the attack on us. That there's these wonderful texts you can read where people say that, you know, that Jewish people are a national minority. They don't use the word Jewish. They sing Bulgarian songs. Their heroes, Slavyakov, Penkov, and so on, are Bulgarian heroes. So at one level, you're having exactly the same process. That notion that we must love and support the in-group. That's there in what Goebbels says. It's there in what led to those mobilizations in Bulgaria. What differs is the way in which you draw the boundary of us and them. So in the German case, ethnic comrade implies that someone non-ethnically German is out-group, should be excluded, and if seen as a danger, should be exterminated. In Bulgaria, you see that Jews aren't out-group, they're part of the in-group. So the issue isn't one of human psychology. The psychology is the same. It's the same psychology of solidarity with the in-group. It's that political and social question of how you draw those boundaries between us and them. And when we come to racism and the like, it's far less about defining them than defining us and who is of us. And that's an absolutely critical question which tells you about the health of the society. And the one thing I would say about Scottish nationalism is that not all nationalisms are the same, because some nationalisms define us and them in ethnic and primordialist and racist terms, and others define it in very different ways. And whatever its limitations, I think over the last 20, 30 years in Scotland, we have seen the forging of a civic nationalism whereby people like me can be defined as Scots. It's not perfect, and it doesn't always work, but I think it has real consequences. So going from the sublime to the ridiculous, a few years back, we did a very simple experiment, right? It was a young woman of Chinese origin wearing a Scotland shirt who falls over and spills her pencils and everything, and do people help her? Now, beforehand, we have talked to these people. We've either given them a civic definition or an ethnic definition of Scottishness. When we give them an ethnic definition, then by her face, she is other, they don't help her. When we give a civic definition, by her shirt and the badge over her heart, she is in group, she is Scottish, and people actually help her. So the question of how we define us and them is not rooted in nature, it's not rooted in biology, it's not rooted in psychology. It's rooted in society and politics, but it has profound psychological consequences in terms of whether we believe people, trust people, support people, or on the other hand, completely ignore their plight. So it's in our hands, and it's the key question we need to ask politically, and it's the key criterion by which we need to judge our politicians. Great,
that's wonderful, Stephen. I've got two more comments that I'm going to put to you from the audience because they're both just so powerful. Rose Stevens says, this has been such a fascinating discussion. My question is, how can people still continue to have trust in governments and leaders when they have been proved to be liars? I trusted and supported Tony Blair until the invasion of Iraq was proved to be justified by lies. So it was, you know. How can people still trust the Johnson and Trump leaderships when they have been proved to intentionally say things that are not true? And related to that, because both of these leaders have in their time had the support of this particular media organisation, Renee, who has made various comments during the discussion, says, media influence What is the view on the indisputable influence of Rupert Murdoch in our politics via his editorial control of tabloids and broadsheets in the UK, which is anti-European and pro-UKIP? And for Rupert Murdoch, you can say the whole panoply of right-wing media owners who have influenced our public debate. And I think those are going to be the last questions that we can focus on. So I'm going to give each of our wonderful panelists a chance to pick up on those. And then I think we'll have to wind up, which is a shame because it is already 7:23. Darren, do you want to come back on either of those?
I think I kind of covered that earlier in terms of just the sort of the hierarchy of concerns that people have. It's not necessarily that anybody that supports someone like Trump or someone like Boris Johnson completely 100% endorses every single dimension of their belief and behaviour and political outlook.
Do you think people trust them though, Darren? Do you think people trust Trump?
I think people see them as a means to an end, and I think that they distrust them less than what they see as the alternatives. So I think the distrust is pretty widespread. It's really that old kind of picking the best of a bad bunch, which is what politics always is for people of a certain social class, to be honest. But I'm happy just to hand the floor over to Stephen now to finish.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Stephen.
Morally, if the question is asked morally, how can you support a Trump or a Johnson? I don't understand, just like others don't understand. If you ask empirically, well, years ago, if you remember, George Bush, the younger George Bush, was mocked for his Bushisms. They misunderestimate me. The French don't have a word for entrepreneur, and so on. And there is some evidence that he did those things deliberately. This man was part of a Yale East Coast aristocracy, right? And he posed as the ordinary guy. And the more he said these things and intellectuals sneered at him, the more he could say, look, I'm like you, I'm one of you. And in sneering at me, they're doing exactly the same thing. In exactly the same way that when Hillary Clinton described supporters of Trump as deplorables, she reinforced his overall categorical narrative of us ordinary guys against this liberal sneering elite. And Trump is superb. You asked us to do provocations. If there's one person who's superb at provocations, it's Donald Trump. He is quite excellent at provoking his opponents into acting in ways that then sustains his overall narrative of, I'm the overall guy from the, I mean, it's completely false, but it's his narrative. I'm the ordinary guy from the wrong side of the tracks. I'm like you. You've been sneered at. I've been sneered at. So I think we need to understand the process by which Trump is a superb, what I call entrepreneur of identity, very good at creating these categories and these identities and bringing together those who feel sneered at and feel ignored and to feel he is one of them. And if we play into his hands, then we empower him. And we shouldn't take it for granted that he will be defeated in November. And the more we understand him, the less likely it is that he'll be re-elected.
I don't know where to start in thanking both of you. I'm going to take two takeaways from this, and they're both ones that are quite close to my heart. But I think everything we've heard from Darren speaks of the huge damage caused by 40 years of an ideology that made people feel excluded from society if they were not economically successful. The divisive effect of that, both literally in terms of people's wealth and well-being and ability to cope, and psychologically in terms of people's perception of themselves as being excluded and as you've just said, despised or treated without respect or not listened to at all, has been immeasurable. And the role of New Labour in that, I think, has been mentioned by our questioners as well as by you, has been extremely important, because that was the moment at which Labour too said, we don't speak for the working class anymore. We don't want any grubby trade unionists putting off our middle class voters. We don't want that flat cap image. We want to be middle class too. And at that moment, really, there was bound to be a huge section of society which felt abandoned and was ripe for exploitation. My grandfather, God, who was born in 1882 used to say there is no substitute, if you want a peaceful, harmonious society, for looking after people's basic equality and basic needs. People have to have access to work, to housing, to food that is good, or they will, you know, fragment and begin to hate one another and on one line or another. And I think that fundamental truth remains true. If you neglect people's basic well-being, then all of these bad things and collapses of trust can follow. The other, which is a lesser thing, but I think it is important, is the thing that Stephen was mentioning just latterly there, which is the kind of ideology that you bring to the idea of what your community is. And I think one of the successes of the SNP over the last 30 years, and you know, it's an ideological success, not necessarily a success on the ground, but they have very much foregrounded this ideology of anyone who's in Scotland can be Scottish, anyone who wants to be included can be included. And while, of course, people often fail to live up to ideologies like that, nonetheless, the presence of the ideology gives people who want a better and more inclusive kind of culture at least somewhere to put their foot, somewhere to begin the argument. So those two things, I think, would be my takeaways from this. I'm sorry to kind of impose them on you in a way, but, you know, it's good to sort of record what you've taken from an event. I'm just so sorry that we couldn't hear more from the audience, all of whom have put down fantastic remarks. I think I'm going to finish with what Dee Dee has just said here. She's quoting John Hume again, and she says, John Hume says, you can't eat a flag, and that's true. Meeting basic needs is essential. But I just want to give another huge thank you to our wonderful speakers, to Stephen and to Darren. Both of you have just given us so much of yourselves and such brilliant insights during this session, and it's been an absolute privilege to be here to chair it. Thank you again to the Just Festival, and thank you to everyone who's been involved in organising this, and a personal round of applause from me to Stephen, to Darren, and to everyone who's asked such terrific questions today. Thank you.
And for us, to you, Joyce.
Thank you, Joyce.
Yes, thank you, Joyce.